this is really for the questions.
Okay. All right, welcome back to the next session on public diplomacy in the information age. We will discuss the interlinkages between public diplomacy and the information revolution. I want to remind everyone about the hashtag, which is hashtag NGDP Forum 2018. So feel free to also participate in the conversation online. So it seems that the information age is both bringing a unique set of opportunities and challenges when it comes to public diplomacy. On the one hand, we see opportunities to engage with stakeholders in new and more direct ways. At the same time, we see the risk for weaponized information and the rapid spread of disinformation, along with the general decline in public faith in traditional media and in institutional actors, which is presenting new challenges. So what are the emerging trends in the public diplomacy field that are relevant for NATO and to Georgia? How to better reach out during the information age? And what are the particular roles, not only of decision makers, but also of the legislative branch and other actors in strategic communications? So to discuss all of these issues, we've assembled a really terrific panel. I'll just introduce them very briefly. To my left is Mr. Mark Lady, who's the Communications Director at NATO SHAPE. Mark previously served as the Chief Strategic Communications, and as such, was a leading role in developing NATO Stratcom. Prior to that, he spent time in Afghanistan, where he was the NATO spokesperson in Kabul and media advisor to the ISAF commander. Before that, he was special advisor to the NATO Secretary General, Lord Robertson, and NATO's deputy spokesperson. And before that, he spent time in journalism. To his left is Matt Armstrong. Mark is an associate fellow at the King's College London Centre for Strategic Communications and serves on the editorial board of NATO Stratcom Centre for Excellence. He was previously governor of the Broadcasting Board of Governors, overseeing the US government's international media, and also executive director of the US Advisory Commission on Public Diplomacy. And to our far left, last but not least, is Sophie Katsarova, who is the chairperson of the Committee on Foreign Affairs in the Parliament of Georgia. She's the head of the Georgian delegation to the OEC Parliamentary Assembly, and is also a member of the delegations to the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe and the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. Before becoming an MP in 2016, Sophia served 11 years at the British Embassy here in Tbilisi. So warm welcome to all three of our panelists. So the way this is going to work, each panelist is going to provide some quick introductory remarks for about 10 minutes, and then we really want to open this up for questions and answers from all of you. So I'm going to turn it over first to Mark to kick us off. And maybe just to frame your intervention, what are some of the developments in the field of public diplomacy that you are paying the most attention to from a NATO perspective? And how is NATO working to respond, but also capitalize on some of these emerging trends in the field of public diplomacy and information?
Well, thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here. I think the first of all is we need to recognize that it's not just a question of picking up the odd thing. It's the question of understanding that there's been radical change almost across the board. And I think, the title of this session, Public Diplomacy in the Information Age, is the first thing is to recognize that the information age is the dominant thing is information. So it has never been more important to get your information right than it is now. And we need to adapt to what the information age is telling us. We need to be more creative. We need to be more imaginative. We need to be more individualized. We actually almost need a root and branch look at how we do business. And that includes very much integrating public diplomacy into the overall diplomatic effort. In fact, I would go further. So we need integration at the core of the diplomatic effort, whether it's in NATO, where I believe it is happening, but also in all of our nations. And there's still a long way to go. We still have an instinct in foreign ministries to do diplomacy, and then we'll get the public guy in to do some bells and whistles. And that's the wrong way round. The P is before the D. The public is before the diplomacy. And we need to really look at integrating it. But even more, we need cross-government. I would argue that public diplomacy is itself almost a non sequitur now. It's almost past its sell-by date. I have argued that in NATO, we should change the name of the Public Diplomacy Division to the Stratcom Division. And actually, if you look at the definition of strategic communications, it is the coordinated and appropriate use of public diplomacy, public affairs, PSYOPs, and InfoOps. So in other words, PD is a part of Stratcom, and yet we've got a public diplomacy division. And I think it shows how far we've got to come before we actually really recognize that we need to integrate our overarching information effort. It's a cross-government effort. And public diplomacy tends to marginalize. And I think Matt, who's been in this area, will look at that more. So it is not a separate line of effort. I think the Russians, in that respect, are showing us the way. If you look at how they are doing what we would call PD, and I would call information confrontation as they would, Maria Zakharova. Now, what country has got a spokesperson like that, who mocks, laughs at, pokes fun at, insults? Nobody. But you know what? It kind of works. Look at the attention. Could you name any other spokesperson than Maria Zakharova? So you know who she is. She gets reported. When she pokes fun at Georgia, it'll be reported. Look at what's happening with some of their embassies. The UK embassy for Moscow, their tweets are followed by huge numbers of people, including the British media. So when we say something about Moscow, their embassy comes out and says something witty or not witty, and it gets reported by the BBC and everyone else. Now that is public diplomacy. How many of our embassies are routinely picked up because of some smart comment? They're not. So, like it or hate it, then that's something we need to be thinking about. And that reflects that they understand that diplomacy in the modern age is essentially public. It also reflects that they understand it's part of the information confrontation, because what she and the others say is part of a bigger picture. So their role is not public diplomacy. Their equivalent of Stratcom, insofar as it exists, would be information confrontation. They're integrated into something much, much bigger. And they're not the only ones. If you look at China, the way that they have integrated their information effort through their 3 warfares, if you look at the way that the Russians regard new generation warfare, they see information confrontation as part of many other things. Economics, conventional diplomacy, all the aspects of soft power, active measures, all of it is part of something that happens before you go to war, and may indeed stop you going to war because you win, because you've achieved your strategic objectives before you even get to that point. And I would say, therefore, that the challenge for PD is to transform itself very, very radically. I think it's very easy when people say we are at war, because war means something very specific to people. It generally means explosions, aeroplanes, bang, bang, people dying. But we are in a confrontation. We are in a conflict. Shaping operations are underway. No country knows that better than Georgia. What is happening to you are shaping ops. And what's the main weapon of shaping operations? Well, it's actually information, along with other things. Economic efforts, active measures, moving borders at the dead of night. All of these things, all below the level of conflict, but actually to achieve a very clear goal. So public diplomacy really needs to reform itself and maybe even change its name into something much bigger. And that means training, resources, centrality to it. Nobody should be an ambassador who cannot carry the weight in public. I'll say that quite bluntly, because if you cannot do it publicly, then actually you're probably in the wrong profession. And that isn't any more smoke-filled rooms or corridors with fellow ambassadors. You've got to get out there. And critical, final point, it's all about taking the initiative. We lose when we don't know what we're trying to do. We've got to stop reacting, and we've got to start taking the initiative. So when we're uncertain about what we want to do, that's when we have a big problem. So a critical part of a good information strategy is actually a strategy. And too often, we don't have that strategy. So those are based on our values, what our countries are trying to achieve. So I'm quite proud of our public diplomacy division. I think they're doing a good job. I really do. And I think, you know, they have transformed themselves. Time to change their name. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Mark. Now let me turn it over to you, Matt. We used to talk about the battle for hearts and minds in strategic communications. Is this still a relevant concept in your view? And as we've heard, what about public diplomacy? Is this still a useful or relevant term? So what should a strategy be for addressing not just today's challenges, but also tomorrow's challenges, if you want to address them?
So thank you, and thank you for allowing me to be here. It's a tremendous opportunity, and I appreciate it. It's a good question. I've got 3 points. There's a slide that I would like to put up, and this is just background. It's reference for you. The first bullet point is that this is not new. This is old. You talk about a new information environment. It's not new. That is a British psychologist, F.C. Bartlett. So let me get in. I've got 3 points. I'll address the questions. First, I don't think the battle for hearts and minds was ever an appropriate phrase. This is not a battle. It's not something you win or lose. It's not something you gain points on. It's not something that finishes and you move on to something else. This is an enduring struggle for minds and wills, not hearts and minds. It's not a contest of likability. And the struggle for minds and wills is the phrase that was used in the 40s and the 50s. You're trying to affect somebody's will to act in some way, either in support of your action, your policy, or not in opposition to it. This gets to the other point that I'll demur a little bit from Mark's point about information. I think it's on point, but I think the currency here is not information, but it's people. This isn't a battle of information. This is a battle of public opinion. It is a battle to affect people's will to act. So we need to remember that, and that is why public appears in the phrase public diplomacy. Now, just for historic reference, if you look at newspapers in the United States, for example, in the 1940s and 1950s, you see the term public diplomacy get used, because the Soviets, prior to a conference or immediately after a conference or meeting, they would step in front of reporters and make a statement. It would be diplomacy in public, much like the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs spokesperson does today. That is public diplomacy, and it's something that has been going on for a long time. This is the continuation of politics through other means. It requires speed, agility. It's an enduring activity, not a one-off engagement. It's not something on the side. It is the combination of policy, words, and actions. It is not pixie dust you sprinkle onto the problem after the fact. It is something that needs to be part and parcel, integrated into the process at the beginning, which takes me to the second point. Public diplomacy, the term, segregates, does not integrate. In the United States, the term was originated as a way of, as part of a bureaucratic fight between the State Department and the United States Information Agency, between the Foreign Service officers of the State Department and the Foreign Service Information officers of the U.S. Information Agency. It is a bureaucratic term. It is much like the terms new media and old media. It's adversarial. It separates, not integrates. If we look at the U.S. perspective, it is the same thing. It separates, segregates. It moves it off to the side. That's both bureaucratic and operational. It has a problem. And so, as far as the legislative aspect, which was part of the question of this panel, it creates confusion in the legislative branch and the executive branch. What is this thing? Where does this fit? Where does psychological operations begin and end? Where does political warfare begin and end? Where does public affairs begin and end? Where does strategic communication begin? What is public diplomacy? Because in the United States, up until about 8 years ago, it was a trademark term of the State Department. I had a Defense Department official yell at me, literally, at a conference. Defense Department does not do public diplomacy. That is something the State Department does. This is a problematic term. I have a master's in public diplomacy. I'm an academic in public diplomacy as well as a practitioner of it. And I don't understand what this thing means. And it's not a helpful term. So it also, in this world of borderless environment, where information crosses your borders, where does it fit in with psychological defense? This gets into who owns your narrative. Do you own it? Does somebody else own it? If you don't speak up in the manner that is conducive to the people, that the people want to hear, not just on the platform, does it matter? So this is part of where does it fit? Is it part of your foreign ministry? Is it part of your homeland security? Yes and yes. Is it part of your defense ministry? Yes and yes and yes. Everybody does this. In the United States, in the period, in the 10 years prior to these other three quotes on the screen, the United States Treasury, the United States State Department, United States Defense Department, they were tied partners in what we would call public diplomacy today, and what we would call political warfare, which gets to this other element of this same second point, and that is what you consider public diplomacy, the other side may consider political warfare. And that's not necessarily inaccurate. Sweden's public diplomacy towards the United States, probably not seen as political warfare. US public diplomacy towards the Russian population, is by the Kremlin seen as political warfare. Doesn't mean the activities are any different. So this goes back to where does political warfare begin and end. Sometimes it depends on your intent, sometimes it depends on how it's received. So this creates tremendous confusion. And then in the American perspective, and I'm going to raise this as a lesson, Americans, and I've seen prominent former senior leaders in the intelligence community as well as our foreign ministry, State Department, exclaim about we need the United States Information Agency back to fight the political warfare. USIA was never about political warfare. Well, we need the Active Measures Working Group back to fight political warfare. Well, the polygraph program out of Radio Free Europe has had a longer lifespan, a greater audience, and a greater effect across more topics than the Active Measures Working Group did, which was operationally effective for barely a year. So my point of that is that even with the United States, who we've been playing in this space for a while, we actually don't have a history in political warfare. We don't have an understanding of our history, and so we misrepresent our history. So this is a lesson for the legislative and the executive of you need to develop it on your own. Every nation has a separate relationship. And this takes me to the third point, which is what Mark raised. Strategies first, tactics are second. We keep talking about how the Russians, for example, but we can talk about the Chinese, we can talk about the Iranians, we can talk about non-state actors, we can go on to other groups of how are they operating in this space as if we want to come up with a counter to that activity. Well, by framing it in that way, we are allowing the adversaries to set the time, tempo, manner, and place of engagement. That's reactive, and that is not going to be beneficial. You can't play defense. It doesn't mean you have to have an aggressive offense, but you need to get ahead of the ball. There's a famous quote by a famous hockey player. It's not that he knew where the puck was going to be. And how are you going to know that? Well, you need to know what you want tomorrow to look like. Why are you in this game? What do you want tomorrow to be? And so you lay out, what do I want to achieve? And that's a problem for the executive and the legislative. I was the head of a U.S. federal agency. I was a governor on the Broadcasting Board of Governors, which was in charge of the Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, and several other broadcasters, as well as a large Internet Freedom program. It wasn't up to me or my colleagues on the board. This is something that comes from the White House and the Congress, but it's the White House ultimately. So in the Georgian sense, the legislature, as well as the executive, you have to get them on board, and they have to understand why. So let me, and another point that you'll get from these quotes is that the tactics remain the same. I can give you a tremendous number of examples. There's a congressional testimony by an assistant secretary of the CIA, assistant director of CIA, a guy named Richard Helms at the time. And he's talking about, and it was 1960, I think it was, maybe 1959, and he talks about a misinformation campaign by the Russians where they would put information into newspapers. Then they would cite, and they would explode it out through a network to plant misinformation and disinformation. It's exactly like today. It's just in the old media, quote unquote. So the tactics remain the same, the techniques are different. So one last scenario. On August 10th, so you tell me, is this political warfare, is this public diplomacy, is this PSYOP? On August 10th, 1945, the US realized that the Japanese government was, yes, in negotiations about ending the war. This was a day after the second atomic bomb was dropped. But they were not telling their own people. This was worldwide news at the time. Everybody else in the world knew. It was being broadcast, but the Japanese were jamming it from coming inside. So on August 11th, the Secretary of State goes to the President and says, we need to do something about this. The President approves. 30 minutes later, the Office of War Information is given the order to execute a program. Less than 60 minutes later, they draft language that they were going to drop on Japan. Humorously, it took another 2 hours for the State Department to modify and confirm and finalize on that draft. Within 30 minutes of that time, it was received in Honolulu by wireless. They developed the leaflet that they're going to do. They then converted a 100,000-watt transmitter in Honolulu to do what they called radio photo. Today we would call fax, to transmit it to Saipan, which was our B-29 base in the Pacific. It was received there and produced into, reassembled and made into leaflets. Within 24 hours of the President giving the thumbs up, 3 million leaflets were being dropped on Japan by B-29s in 8 cities. Now, what was going on there? They're affecting the public's view of the world to shape the opinion and attitude and decision by the Japanese military governmental leadership. And they admitted after the war that that made them move. A contemporary writer said that validated the cost of the Office of War Information, that one activity. Now that took 24 hours to execute because there was a strategy, because there was intent, there was political will. Do you think any of our programs today can take 24 hours to try to reach 3 million people across 7 cities in a nation? If we have the will, we can execute, but we have to understand what we're trying to do. So with that, just enjoy these quotes. They could be today. The last quote, the second part of the quote, and we have not in any major sense prepared to fight the kind of war both Russia and China surely intend to press. And I think that's the same sentiment that is today. And Sulzberger was speaking about political warfare. So thank you, and I look forward to the questions. That's the better part of this panel.
Great, thanks, Matt. Very interesting. And let me turn you over to Sophie, maybe to offer a Georgian perspective here. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about the context, but also the threat of disinformation in Georgia, how it is currently being handled, and also a little bit about the role of legislative branches, drawing on your experience from the Georgian parliament. Please.
Thank you very much. Of course, it is my privilege to sit in this terrific panel with such distinguished experts and speakers. And thanks for your questions. Indeed, the context is very important, although some of our colleagues in the morning already touched upon it very briefly, but it's thanks for allowing me this opportunity to speak a bit more about the challenges. There is an ongoing and active debate on the importance of strategic communications, and I fully agree this is very important, that we should take it very seriously, particularly against the backdrop of intensified propaganda, anti-Western propaganda, and often the use of disinformation as an instrument to slow down or undermine Georgia's way towards European and Euro-Atlantic space. And we have seen, and this is not a novelty either, that we have seen this recent development is becoming more and more obvious in recent years, particularly that technologies advance, cyber threats increase, and propaganda techniques become more and more sophisticated. And this is actually the context that makes it easier to infiltrate certain groups in the society, which is another aspect of discussion, in fact. But the good news is that our political resilience is fully capable to pass this test, as the country stands very firm on its unwavering path to build democratic institutions and reform in a way that would meet the standards of the very alliances that we seek to become part of. And we have heard very strong messages and consolidated messages this morning from all leaders of all branches this morning, and that is the message to the public. And this is part of strategic communications. And now that we speak a lot about strategic communications and why this is important, and at least in this room, everybody realizes why strategic communications is important, I would still revisit the theme which I think we need to reinforce as a message. Yes, a lot is being done to achieve a more coordinated approach towards strategic communication. This is extremely important for our country, but we would encourage more coordinated and unified approach towards stratcoms. And this is a well-trodden subject area, we all know that, but stratcoms should be at the heart of the strategy and policy making, and that's something that we already heard during this panel. It is important that we make stratcoms as the policy making process part of it, and we have a unified approach towards strategic communications as an instrument, and we all agree, and experience shows that this is the best and one of the most effective tools to counter the inflow of large wave of misleading information. And we know what are the consequences of spreading the misleading information in the society. So that's why it is important that, yes, we do a lot, we have that very coordinated approach, but that's where I see the role of Parliament to reinforce the process and bring up the issue of the role of Parliament, how to support the process. In simple terms, yes, strategic communication should be at the heart of all national policy-making process. And in simple and broader terms, we also know that strategic communication is not just about countering disinformation or harmful information from those who wish us ill. It's a much more, it's a broader concept, the concept which means that we have to continue to build on positive narrative, which would ultimately remove anti-democratic, i.e. anti-Western narrative from the equation. That is the bottom line, that our own stories that we create, that's what we are trying to achieve in the process, the stories that we create that would resonate with all segments of the society across the country. This is how we should be approaching strategic communications, and not just as a tool to counter the propaganda, which is in itself a big concern for our country. No one is turning a blind eye to that. We work towards that, but we should have more coordinated approach toward the concept of strategic communications. And I would like to thank actually many in this room because from all their perspective, they contribute to this process, be it donors or civil society or media, because that is the role of all spectra of society, as well as the executive branch. And now I go back to the point of the role of the legislation, why it is important to involve the Parliament in the strategic communication concept. Where does it fit in the bigger picture? Although Stratcoms is quite new to Georgia, and the concept and the idea of it only emerged 3-4 years ago, and against the backdrop, I should say that we have achieved a lot. Good news is, again, that there is a full realization of the importance of strategic communications, why we need it. But now we have to expand the circle and allow legislation, for example, legislative branch, to be part of the process. And why? In the first place, it is our role as parliamentarians to represent the electorate, and we are the ones who communicate most intensively with the public about all the reforms that we are carrying out, reforms that support democratic building of democratic institutions, i.e. our westward policy and foreign policy. This is crucially important that we reach out public, not just through social media, but that's also important given the title of this panel, how to reach out better in the information age. Yes, social media, direct dialogue, public dialogue. However, another aspect that the Parliament has, which is crucially important, and we are gaining that mandate more and more, and there is a growing realization of that, particularly after the adoption of the amendments to the Constitution, Parliament's role is increasing and has increased. And we would like to utilize it to the maximum extent. How? When it comes to strategic communications. Oversight and scrutiny is one other important aspect that we deploy and will continue to deploy in our work. I don't think that there are any questions about the fact that with our oversight functions and scrutiny functions, what we will bring in is more accountability, more openness, and more transparency to the whole process. So represent, legislate, and overseeing and scrutiny are the key factors that we can bring in when we talk about strategic communications, and not just, again, would like to highlight, not just while countering disinformation, but generally creating stratcoms as a national policy. So to sum it up, what I mean, the first is the context, and we can talk endlessly, actually, what are the challenges in the country, and Georgia is not unique when we talk about disinformation and propaganda warfare. Context, we are aware of the context. We know what the solutions are. We know the actions that we are taking. Clear definition and understanding what strategic communications is, and more coordinated approach towards this, and obviously the role of Parliament to boost the process and make it more accountable and transparent. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Sophia. So we're going to open it up to questions. We have about 20 minutes. I want to bring in as many people as possible, but let me just, before I do so, turn quickly to Mark. You mentioned, the public diplomacy concept maybe not being as useful anymore, but we do have the new Center for Stratcom, Center for Strategic Communications, within NATO. So could you tell us a little bit about the experience so far? I know you've played an instrumental role in setting this up. What has been the experience so far with this new center in terms of filling some of the gaps that you identified within NATO?
Well, in one word, positive. I think people were kind of saying we need to do Stratcom before a lot of people really knew what it was. We felt the need, but we didn't quite know what we needed. And it's actually been very important to have a center of excellence to bring a bit more rigor, a bit more consistency, a bit more intellectual focus on it. So I think they're producing a lot of products. They're providing a center where people can go to. I mean, anyone who wants to, even simple things like their website, provides as many journals, academic papers as one could possibly hope for. And so I think they've performed a very, very valuable role. They're still developing, and I think that they are broadening the scope. I don't mean, it's slightly lighthearted, but also serious at the same time to say that the problem, and I think, Matt and I furiously agree on this, which is that PD limits, and the whole thing that we're seeing is that the breadth of approaching how we deal with the information challenges requires a broad approach. It requires an intellectual approach. It requires all sorts of sciences, behavioral psychology. They all need to be brought in. We need to get real. And I think the Center of Excellence has played a big part in that process.
Excellent. And let me also turn to you, Matt. It was interesting what you mentioned, the lessons from the Cold War, and I think some of your quotes captured that very well. But I'm wondering, it seems like also the context has changed a lot compared to the Cold War days. So could you just elaborate a little bit more on how some of the things that were done, at least in an American context, during those days are relevant today in terms of having I think you described a kind of a central government agency kind of spearheading some of these efforts. It seems like today the flow of information is so much more rapid that a lot of these things may require different kind of solutions, or how applicable are those lessons on today's context?
So it's a good question, because inherent in the question, I think, is a problem I see frequently, and that is an understanding that the Cold War was what I would call in two phases. There is the capital C, capital W Cold War, which was a bipolar West versus East, USSR versus USA. But prior to that, in the 40s and the 50s, and ending in about the early 60s, it was a little c, little w Cold War. And if you look at the contemporary writing, textbooks, newspapers, congressional testimony, international conversations, it was a stateless, ideological struggle of information swaying people's opinions, full of misinformation, lies, existential threats. The walls weren't up yet. The borders were not set yet. And it was seen as the solution set was seen as part of a whole of society approach. The quotes from 61, 62, Senator Dodd, and one of the other quotes, that was the tail end of an effort to create something called the Freedom Academy, which I've written about. There's an article, War on the Rocks, about this, and an article and a chapter in a forthcoming King's College book. And this was in an effort to train U.S. government officials, U.S. civil society officials, foreign government officials, foreign civil society leaders on what are the tactics, techniques, and procedures of the communist, not just Russian, but this ideological struggle, the communist tactics of subversion. And so in a very real sense, it's very much like today. There was a dramatic rise in the flow of information, the speed and the flow of people. So yes, today I think the risk of failure is greater because the speed of information is that much greater. The movement of people is that much faster. Mm-hmm. And what I call the democratization of disruption. An individual can now cause vast disruption, either through an explosive act or through an informational act. So the cost of failure has gone up significantly. But then you had this broad understanding the legislative was deeply engaged in the conversation. And today you do not have that in the U.S.
Okay.
So that's part of why I'm bringing that up and bringing it to the forward. In fact, the establishment of USIA, if I may, just this last point, the establishment of USIA by President Eisenhower was part of his reorganization of the United States government along what we now call DIME model, diplomacy, information, military, and economics. But it was the lesser part of a two-part reorganization of the U.S. government to fight the psychological war that was going on. And he said, we need, as a presidential candidate, we need to stop being afraid of that $5, five-syllable word, psychological. And he reorganized government. But we forget about USIA was actually the smaller part of a two-part massive government reorganization to combat the world and operate in the world that we had.
Mm-hmm. Mark, you had a two-finger.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that. I think the intelligent appreciation and analysis of history, always shows the same thing, that principles endure and tactics change and techniques change. And I think one of the reasons that the Russians and actually the Chinese have been pretty effective is because actually they read their own history. And so, as Matt was indicating, what they've done is, well, what did we do in the Cold War? And now how do we update it? And what they've done is they've updated it. And so things like Maskarov and New Generation Warfare, you keep seeing the same themes coming up. So if we look back, we can learn a lot. But you then need to say, okay, how does this fit to the techniques? And the problem, of course, we all have is that the speed of events means that thinking time has been dramatically reduced. And it's, of course, you can always make up stuff quicker than you can find the truth. Mm-hmm. So thinking time has been reduced, but principles haven't.
Yeah. And Sophie, I thought it was interesting, you talked both about the need for more societal resilience, but you also talked about the need for positive narratives. And I'm wondering, it seems like the narratives about the European Union and NATO have greatly inspired Georgia, and we see the results of that looking at Georgia today. But I'm wondering, I just want to see what you have to say about you know, because we talk a lot in the West today about the West being in crises. We see the rise of populism within Europe. We've seen the Euro crisis in Europe. We see political turbulence. So are the narratives about Euro-Atlantic integration still as compelling in a country like Georgia today as they used to be? And is there a need to kind of rethink what those positive narratives are in order to also help build and shape the societal resilience that you talk about?
Thank you very much, and that's a very topical question, actually. But what I mean when I say that we need to continue to build positive narrative is that I do not mean that we should not be positive to the extent that we lose the reality and we do not show what the real context is to the society. In other words, what is crucially important in Georgia is to be honest with the society that we represent, and that gives us more credibility. Again, in other words, what I believe is right is not to raise the expectations about too much of positive narrative, but being realistic about what our expectations are towards the EU and towards NATO, and at the same time discuss what the challenges are. Because yes, there is a lot more access to information these days, which is great. People do people do read information, they see what's happening across Europe, across the West, and they do challenge us about Europe, about NATO, about our future aspirations. But this is what I mean, be realistic and do not mislead the public. And that makes us credible in the eyes of the public. And that's why I believe the public support towards our foreign policy, i.e. EU and NATO integration, is the highest ever if we compare it to previous years. Do not raise their expectations is one rule, and lessons learned from our side, and we also learn from our lessons from the past, and discuss and encourage our society to be critical and to make the informed decisions. And that's what we try to support.
Excellent. All right, so we have a couple of questions. I'm going to start over here in the first row, if we can get a microphone, please. And then we'll go. Okay, excellent. Start here. Please. And please introduce yourself, name and affiliation, and try to keep the question short to allow for as many questions as possible.
Andis Kudors, Center for East European Policy Studies, Latvia. I will start with two short comments, one for what Mr. Markleti said. I'm really glad that you kept this example from Maria Zakharova, and she is one phenomena, and this we can see rudeness, irony, sarcasm, and even lies are routine of nowadays Russian diplomacy. And the other comment, and then I will raise question. Other comment is what Mr. Armstrong said about, I'm glad also that you spoke about Cold War, and I believe in nowadays Russian propagandists are really better and more skillful than those who fight from Soviet side and during Cold War. Why? Because there was an Iron Curtain, and just a few examples from Western information come through this Iron Curtain to Soviet Union, and many people didn't know what is happening outside the Iron Curtain, and that was more easy job for those guys. In nowadays, information is coming through internet, to social media, and even in that kind of context, they are able to manage to persuade people inside of Russia, and some of them even outside. So they are quite skillful. My question is back to ground level, maybe to tactics. What can be proactive approach to those groups who are living in informational bubbles? Like, for example, because they do not care about truth, we want to tell them. They are just living in their own social media networks and internet media, etc. Like, for example, groups in Western Europe, radical right-minded, populistic-minded, or radical left-minded, or part of ethnic Russians in Latvia who are pro-Kremlin-minded, or maybe people in South Ossetia and Abkhazia. So what we can do in a proactive approach to reach them.
Excellent. And then let's do one more from the lady over here.
Leona Kubardia from National Security Council of Georgia. My question will be regarding the hybrid tactics of Russia and building national resilience of the countries and building whole of society approach. What are the best recipes for building national resilience, including the national security system reform? What will be number one priority to achieve the whole of society approach? Because what Russia is doing is trying to divide the society and split with information, disinformation campaigns and with other power instruments. And I will be also glad to hear Ms. Sofia's opinion from the perspective of the Parliament. What are the main challenges of Georgia regarding the building a resilient state and building this whole of society approach? Thank you.
Okay, excellent. So we have two questions. The first one is on a proactive approach to addressing people in an information bubble, and then a question here about hybrid tactics and building a whole of society approach. Maybe, Mark, you want to go first?
Yeah, I mean, they're both good questions, and they deserve long answers, and we don't have a long time. Let me take, there's something that links them both, and that's the word credibility. If you want to penetrate an information bubble, it's no good putting somebody in there who isn't credible to the people inside the bubble. So, for instance, if you've got an anti-NATO bubble, then I can be as articulate as you like. It isn't going to work. I'm a NATO spokesman. So you need to find people who can penetrate that bubble. And that means essentially they've got to be people who are credible to people inside the bubble, which is really hard. But basically you're wasting your time if your messenger is not credible to people inside the bubble. The second thing, which is quite hard to do, but sometimes, is to say, do the people inside this bubble matter? I mean, there's an awful lot of audiences out there. And so one of the things you can do, there's only 24 hours in a day, we're always under-resourced. You've got to pick your targets. If you've got a totally hardline information bubble, the first question you say is, do they matter? Because there's always more time, more effort you can put into somebody else. So the first question is, do I care? And that really is just a hard-nosed, do I matter? Can I just die? The second thing is messengers, which then actually goes back to your point, which is about resilience. A whole of society approach is, again, it's about credible players. We saw, for instance, if you take Ukraine, that the most credible people were civil society because they were seen as honest and they didn't have an axe to grind. So when you are developing resilience, the whole of society approach is absolutely critical. You've got to bring in other people. People like their peer group. And that's one of the things that we have to learn. Find your peer group. Find the one-to-one. And then the last point is, it is a very individual thing. When I was a journalist, I was a television broadcaster. The best lesson I learned was as a BBC correspondent, I would often broadcast to multiple millions at once. But each of those millions tended to be on their own in front of a television or with only 2 or 3 other people. So I learned that actually I didn't broadcast to the room like I am now, I broadcast to one person. So a lot of the modern connection, it's about individualism. It's about recognizing you're one person speaking to one person times a million. But you're not speaking to a million people. I hope that's useful.
Matt, Sophie, do you want to come in quickly?
So yeah, so they're definitely related, so that's as if it was planned. That was good planning. Latvia, Lithuania, you both have these problems, and as you know, and you didn't put this in your question just for simplicity, but there are multiple Russian language audiences in each country, right? And then everywhere else too. You have this Poland, you have elsewhere. So to add to Mark, and not to repeat what Mark said, but this is an enduring struggle. So part of this is part of building resilience, psychological defense, a whole bunch of different phrases labels you can put onto this. But part of this is what we would call news literacy, media literacy, right? How do they trust the media? Why don't they trust it? What are they source? Are they actually paying attention to the source? This also gets into, as Mark was getting to, the relations with their other folks, and this is the proxies. This is your grassroots engagement, and this is part of why you want to make sure you look at the different groups of people And so maybe one group is harder to reach, so you go to the second group. And because you've got multiple Russian language groups, who in my visits to Latvia as well as Lithuania, I just sat back when I met with a bunch of different Russian language groups and watched them fight each other. They could care less than American senior government official was in the room. They were arguing with each other. So you can get involved in that conversation in some way, indirectly or directly, and you need to figure this out. But this is part of why the battle for hearts and minds doesn't work. It's not a battle. It's not a one-off. This is an enduring, ongoing effort. And you need to bring them back into the project. Let's remember what our nations are built on. The nation state is built on a common narrative. Why are they here? What are we trying to do? And I think we've lost, how have we developed our nation? And what does it mean to be a part of the project? It doesn't mean that they all have to have the same view. But this is part of our national project. So think about that. So I just want to throw those out.
Excellent.
And, yeah, go.
Just to briefly add to what has been already said, actually, from my perspective, I tried to cover these points in my opening remarks, talking about the challenges that we have, but at the same time, we do have political resilience. And why do we have that political resilience? Because we continue to build democratic institutions. In other words, we have to continue to implement strategies vigorously and rigorously, and we have to build on national strengths, positive national strengths, which would by default remove the challenges, if not 100%, at least that will strengthen our resilience. So the key to this is to continue to implement strategies and to have positive narrative on national strengths based on the strategies that we continue to implement.
Excellent. So let's pick up two more questions. I have the gentleman over here first.
I'm Rat Bakhtadze, Yata, Georgia. First question goes to the foreign speakers. As you know, EUs are more pro-Western in Georgia, and can we use them as a tools, or can include them in some kind of mechanism to fight against the propaganda and help Georgia integration to the NATO? And second question goes to Ms. Katsarava. Do you think, I know that the information center is doing a lot of things, but do you think it is enough for the youth? And should we include more teaching or learning process in the, for the youth?
Okay, and
Thanks.
then lady in the front, please.
So my name is Nina Nakashidze, and I represent Rustavitu Broadcasting Company. I have more a remark than a question. Mm-hmm. As a television which is very actively involved in countering Russian propaganda, I would like to share my experience on what's hindering the process of countering Russian propaganda. Sometimes when dealing with international organizations, it even strikes my mind that by these methods, the EU and NATO will never be able to overcome Russian propaganda, because the bureaucracy of the European structures makes it very difficult to be flexible in answering the challenges that come from the Russian propaganda. So our idea is that teaching and preaching is not working anymore. What's working is infotainment. Please get involved, people, without being intrusive and without trying to, impose on them the ideas. According to our experience, Russian is using very, I would say, perfectly such means as, let's say, humor. Such means that making ridicule some European and American politicians and so on and so forth. What we are doing, the counter side, is having round tables and having experts with very clever expressions on their face, saying very clever things. It's not working anymore. So please, when trying to sort out what's going on, take these remarks into consideration.
Excellent. And because this is going to be the last round, I want to give Jakob an opportunity as well. He's been waiting, so if we can get the microphone over here. And then if there are any questions on this side, I'll give you one more chance. Please. keep it quick.
Jakub Janda, European Values Think Tank in Prague. I actually have a proposal. Well, there are two problems we are facing. In, let's say, Western Europe, there is limited understanding of the Russian influence threat and also limited will to support a European way for Georgia, let's say it. So what actually is missing is an outreach from Georgian authorities, and I don't mean only in an official way. What the Ukrainian authorities started to do in recent years, they have started, or the NGOs in Ukraine, they have put together lessons learned from countering Russian influence, and they started to go to Western European capitals, Berlin, Brussels, Paris, and others, and actually start to show we are facing a similar problem first, and we actually have some lessons learned you can take away from us. Because this is actually how it works in the EU-NATO environment. You have to show that you face a similar problem, and you have something to show and actually something to propose. So this is what I don't see much from Georgia, coming from Georgia, NGO or government. So that's my proposal to start it up.
Excellent. And then the last questions to the ambassador over here.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Lach, for hybrid threats, Lithuania. Probably I will start with very short two remarks. One is for the Matt, again, using Lithuania as sort of example as far as Russian media. We do not have a lot of Russian media, so don't mix up with other Baltic countries. We have more other problems, but not with the Russian media. This is something different, you know. On the previous remark of the Georgian colleague, saying that the seminars are not working. You know, I think you should understand the very sort of chemistry of democracy. We cannot go against propaganda with our own propaganda. So if its seminars are looks very impressive, we have no other means because we are democracies. So talking with the media, explaining problems, trying to understand the core of problems is one of the answers. Not the only answer, but this is one of the answers. So I don't want you to be discouraged to go to the seminars. But my question for the speakers, where do we stand as far as the Western political leadership understanding the core of the problems?
Okay.
Are we with a more understanding now after Russia is meddling into our elections and so on?
Excellent. So this is going to be the final remarks. We're already out of time, but we started, I think, a few minutes late. So please try to keep your answers short. The questions we have on the table are addressing propaganda. What about teaching and education? The notion of infotainment came up. Lessons learned and the role of NGOs. And then this final question about, do our leaders actually understand the problem? Mark.
Okay, I won't answer all of them because otherwise we will all, so let's kind of pick and choose.
Yeah.
I think, do our leaders understand much more than they did? Do they understand enough? Personally, probably not. But actually the trend is definitely there, and I think we should give credit where credit is due on that. So I think that's a very positive thing. And if you look at the sanctions, if you look at the Skripal case, if you look at all the things that have happened, I think our leaderships are across this in many of the countries. The infotainment thing, which I think goes back to a lot of what I said about individualizing things. You don't necessarily need to do infotainment, but you do need to understand your audience, and you do need to do it in ways that they will listen. I'm a professional broadcaster by trade. I tried to speak in a way that made people interested in what I had to say. The institutional process, which is bad for us and which we should correct, is there is this thing the military call mission command, which is where you give out what needs to be done and then let the people who need to do it work out how to do it. If you have micromanagement, you're always too slow, and the process then becomes bureaucratic and it becomes horribly boring. You need to have people who understand what's wanted. We need a narrative. And then are given the license to be themselves, to be individuals, to be entertaining. Because as I said earlier, we are in a one-to-one situation. And if the person speaking sounds like a speaking clock, or sounds like, here is the press release I was given, they have no credibility. But if they understand what needs to be achieved and are given the license to be themselves, you can achieve amazing things. The Russians actually do a degree of mission command. So it's not so much infotainment, but it's allowing talented individuals with the right narrative to play free to achieve the end that we all need.
Excellent. Matt.
So, extending on Mark's comments, which I agree with entirely, it is in that area. It's not just the government broadcaster. It's not just the largest commercial broadcaster. It's everybody else. And this gets back into the resilience question and how do you penetrate these bubbles. And you have to have that freedom of action. And simply put, if the content is not in a format, style, or medium, whatever it's going to be, that the consumer doesn't like, appreciate, understand, it's useless. So you do have to have that flexibility and dynamic relationship with the audience. As far as are we better, or speaking from, and I think every nation is radically different in this. I think Mark's less than positive comment is rosy as it applies to the U.S. So in my previous positions over the last 10 years of working for and with and advising the Congress, for example, and as head of a federal agency, I would meet with members of Congress who had direct authority. These aren't just random members that might have an interest, but had direct authority either through the authorization side or the appropriation side, that had no idea about any of this. And that's whether it was the DoD side or the State Department side. Public diplomacy, strategic communication. And if you look at the members of Congress in the U.S. that are on this page, you don't see much. If you look at the legislation that was passed 2 years ago at this point, put in by Chairman of the House Armed Services Committee, Thornberry, it was an effort to legislate into, quote, permanence, the Global Engagement Center, and give a mandate. But this is the legislative body. This is not the executive body. And so we have seen, everybody's seen in the public headlines, that entity, right or wrong, whatever it's doing, wherever its role is still not executing as the Congress intended. But you don't have a breadth of, you don't have a process that's in place. So you have individuals in various places in state and defense that are aggressive and want to do something. And you have civil society enterprises that want to do something. But as far as our overall leadership, no, that's another reason why I put those quotes up there, is because we used to get this. I mentioned the Eisenhower quote. We used to get, he literally reorganized government for this. We used to understand this. And this is why I don't like the references to the Cold War or USIA, because it's always the capital Z, capital W, Cold War, USSR versus USA, and that is, by its implication, a gross misunderstanding of the struggle that we went through, and a misunderstanding of the history. And I see this today, and I don't, the U.S. is not in a positive place. I think other countries are a little bit more ahead of this, but no, we're not in a good place yet.
More work to do. Final word to Sophie.
There was a specific question addressed to me
Yes.
about the work of the EU and NATO Information Center,
Right.
and we should give credit to this organization, obviously, for their efforts and what they are doing in this country. And they do a lot, actually. But it should not be just their responsibility when it comes to communication, particularly on such essential issues that we're talking about today. And it is important that we all share this responsibility, and this is the role of Parliament, the role of civil society, the role of media, all stakeholders, and it should be overall effort from everybody's side. And it's never enough. The more you deliver, there is more appetite out there to embrace the information, particularly when we talk about the youth. Only last week, for example, I met, as part of NATO days and as part of EU days, the group of teachers from the region and the group of students in the region. And particularly it is encouraging to see so very well-informed youth. They are our future, and that's why it is important that we all share this responsibility to be the ones to deliver this information to them, in addition to what EU Information Center does.
Excellent. So I think this has been an excellent scene setting for this conference. I think there are a lot of threads here to pick up on and to delve deeper into later this afternoon and tomorrow. Before I ask you to thank the panel, let me just mention that the lunch will take place in the Fellini restaurant, which is on the 2nd floor. And if you could please come back here in 45 minutes at 1:30 for the next session. With that, please join me in thanking our excellent panel.
Thank you. Thank you.